Have you ever dared to confront your deepest fears while alone in the heart of a forest? The unease as darkness envelops you, the rustling leaves that turn into eerie whispers, or strange sounds echoing from unseen corners? These are not figments of imagination, but realities I, Jack, a forest ranger with over 30 years of experience, have faced firsthand. I work in a remote forest in the southern United States, near the Mexican border, a place as breathtakingly beautiful as it is shrouded in dark secrets. Here, every tree, every trail holds chilling stories that only those brave enough to venture into the depths of the woods can understand. Today, join me in Rainy Diaries as we delve into the most spine-chilling experiences of my career, so you can glimpse the mysterious side of nature like never before. Are you ready? Hold your flashlight tight because the darkness is waiting. A party in the shadows. I remember it clearly. A sultry summer night when the air seemed thick with heat and the earthy tang of sap rising from the ground. It was during my early years as a park ranger in a conservation area in the southern United States near the Mexican border. My job was usually uneventful, mostly patrolling trails, checking pathways, and ensuring no one trespassed. But that night, everything changed. The music was faint at first, a ghostly sound in the otherwise absolute silence of the forest. I was patrolling a rarely used trail, my flashlight cutting through the dense foliage. At first I thought I was imagining it, maybe the wind rustling through the branches, but the farther I walked, the clearer the sound became. It was a lively melody, pulsating and intertwined with bursts of laughter carried through the muggy summer air. Something felt off. This area was a restricted zone, strictly off limits. I checked the maps thoroughly. There were no paths leading to where the music was coming from. If anyone was there, they were up to something illegal. I switched off my flashlight, straining my ears. The music, mingled with laughter and even cheers, was unmistakable. My heart raced as I realized this wasn't just a small group. The volume suggested dozens, maybe even 100 people. Who would host a party deep in a forbidden forest? I decided to investigate. Each step I took was careful and deliberate, avoiding the dry twigs that could betray my presence. The music guided me along an overgrown trail until I came to a clearing. Hiding behind a large tree, I steadied my breathing and peered into the open space. The scene was surreal, like something out of a wild fever dream. In the middle of the forest, someone had constructed a makeshift wooden stage adorned with LED lights that bathed the area in a kaleidoscope of colors. A modified truck served as a pop-up bar, bottles of liquor sprawled chaotically across its surface. Dozens of people danced, drank, and shouted like there was no tomorrow. The air was heavy with a pungent mix of cigarette smoke and strong alcohol. These weren't lost campers or casual hikers. Their attire was too strange. Leather jackets, glittering dresses, and half-face masks. The gathering seemed organized, far from a spontaneous party. This realization made me uneasy. Why choose such a remote, forbidden place for this? I reached for my radio to report back to the ranger station, but that's when something bizarre happened. The music stopped abruptly. The laughter and cheers fell silent. The sudden quiet was so complete, I could hear the soft rustle of leaves falling from the trees. My breath caught as a chilling thought struck me. They knew I was there. From the crowd, a tall man wearing an animal hide mask stepped forward. His movements were slow and deliberate, exuding a calm yet menacing confidence. His eyes, visible through the mask, seemed to pierce right through me. Behind him, 5 others began to fan out, moving toward the possible exits from the clearing. "I think we have a guest," the man said, his voice resonating oddly in the hushed forest. Every muscle in my body tensed. No one was supposed to be here except for rangers, and it was clear this group didn't plan to let me leave unscathed. I took a step back, gripping my radio tightly but hesitating to use it. The man approached with an unsettling composure, his voice calm but laced with menace. "What brings you here, my friend? This forest isn't for the curious." Swallowing hard, I forced my voice to remain steady. "I'm a park ranger. You're trespassing in a restricted area. You need to leave immediately." My statement was met with laughter, a cold, mocking sound that sent shivers down my spine. The man removed his mask, revealing a face marred by deep, jagged scars. "A ranger, huh? Perfect. You can entertain us." His words sent a wave of dread through me. I couldn't confront them alone. A quick scan revealed at least 20 people in the group. Some clutched broken bottles and makeshift weapons, their readiness to act clear. This wasn't just an illegal party. This was something far darker, and I didn't want to find out what. I turned and ran. Plunging into the forest, I moved as fast as I could, guided only by instinct and desperation. The laughter and footsteps behind me sounded like a pack of predators closing in. I didn't dare look back. My flashlight remained off, the darkness and my gut the only allies I had. Branches tore at my face and hands, but I kept running, driven by pure adrenaline. Each step felt like a gamble, the forest seeming to close in around me. But then, through the dense shadows, I saw the faint glow of my patrol vehicle's lights. Hope surged as I sprinted toward it, my breath ragged and chest heaving. Reaching the truck, I slammed the door shut and locked it. Sweat drenched my back, and my heartbeat thundered in my ears. Safe at last, or so I thought. As I started the engine, a cold chill gripped me. Across the windshield, someone had scrawled a crude, chilling message in red paint. Do not return. I didn't need a second warning. That night, I drove away from the restricted zone, leaving the haunting events behind. But not the fear. After that night, I couldn't shake the unease from my mind. The images of the strange group in the restricted forest played on repeat every time I closed my eyes. Despite my fear, I knew my job was to protect this forest, even if it meant facing threats as dangerous as they come. About a week later, I received a report of empty liquor bottles, cigarette butts, and large footprints found deep in the restricted area, near the very spot where I had encountered the group. My heart raced as I read the report, but I forced myself to remain calm. This was my chance to uncover what was really happening. I informed Mitchell and requested permission to inspect the area again. Though he wasn't entirely on board, he understood my determination. This time I brought stronger equipment, a more powerful radio, a folding knife, and a small handgun, just for protection. As I stepped into the restricted zone, the silence felt even heavier than before. There were no bird songs, no rustling leaves. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I followed the new traces left behind, discarded liquor bottles, cigarette ashes, and even small scraps of paper written in Spanish, which I couldn't read. The trail led me deeper and deeper until I reached the clearing where the party had taken place. As I had suspected, they had returned. The glow of LED lights flickered through the trees. This time, the music wasn't lively but somber, almost ritualistic. I hid behind a large tree, my eyes scanning the scene carefully. The sight before me wasn't like the wild party I'd seen before. The group now seemed solemn, gathered around a long, black-draped table. On the table sat several large wooden boxes, open to reveal small packages I immediately recognized as drugs. At the center stood an older man, seemingly the leader, speaking loudly in a language I didn't understand. The others nodded as they passed the drug packages among themselves, inspecting and stashing them in backpacks. A cold wave of fear ran down my spine. This wasn't just an illegal party. This was a smuggling operation, and they were using the forest as a transit point. I reached for my radio to report to the ranger station, but then I heard a sound behind me, a faint footstep. So close I could feel the breath of whoever it was. "Back again, Ranger," a familiar, icy voice said. I spun around to see the scar-faced man from before. This time he wasn't wearing a mask, and in his hand was a long, gleaming knife. Two others emerged from the shadows behind him, cutting off any escape route. "You were lucky last time," he said, stepping closer, his eyes blazing with fury. "But this time, there's no way out." I gripped the folding knife in my pocket, trying to steady my voice. "You're trespassing on protected land and breaking the law. I suggest you leave before the authorities arrive." The scar-faced man let out a cruel, mocking laugh. "The authorities? Here? We've owned this forest for years. No one comes here except you." He was right. Out here in the dense forest, no one would arrive in time if I needed help. But I also knew one thing. I couldn't let them think I was weak. "You can't hide forever," I said firmly. "We'll return with a full force. This forest won't be yours to do as you please." The man's expression darkened. "Fine," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "If you want trouble, we'll make sure you never leave." He lunged at me, the knife flashing in the dim light. I instinctively stepped back, drawing my folding knife to defend myself. In that moment, everything happened too quickly to process. He struck, but I managed to sidestep, his blade grazing my shoulder. I knew I couldn't take on all three of them directly. Instead, I turned and bolted, crashing through the dense undergrowth. Their footsteps and curses echoed behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I knew that even a moment's hesitation could be fatal. Through the thick trees, I spotted the faint glow of my patrol vehicle. I had no idea how far I had run, but the sight of the truck gave me a burst of energy. I dove into the vehicle and locked the doors immediately. But as I started the engine, a large rock slammed into the driver's side window, cracking it. The scar-faced man and his accomplices had caught up, their faces twisted in rage. I didn't hesitate. I floored the gas pedal, speeding away from the restricted area. Back at the ranger station, I recounted everything to Mitchell. This time, he didn't merely warn me to be cautious. He picked up the phone and contacted federal law enforcement, reporting everything about the group and their activities. Soon after, a large-scale operation was launched to sweep the area. They found evidence of smuggling, discarded drug packages, traces of their gatherings, but the scar-faced man and his crew had vanished as if they'd never existed. I knew this wasn't the end. People like them always find a way to return, and this forest would remain a silent battlefield. But this time, I was ready. Whether they came back or not, I wouldn't let fear control me. The forest, the darkness, and its horrifying secrets, these were no longer just part of my job. They had become a part of my life. Chapter 2. Fear. It was an unbearably hot summer. The forest air so thick that every breath felt weighted. By that time, I had been a ranger for nearly 10 years, but I had never encountered anything like the reports we were receiving. Mysterious disappearances of wildlife had begun a few weeks earlier. Moose, deer, and even wolves had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but eerily clean skeletons stripped of every bit of flesh as though by an unseen, precise hand. These reports quickly caught the attention of the Wildlife Authority. They sent a team of researchers to investigate, accompanied by me and two fellow rangers, Greg and Angela. We hoped to uncover the cause, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into something beyond comprehension. That morning, we gathered in an area identified as the hot spot for the disappearances, a dense, secluded part of the forest that rarely saw human presence. As we entered, I couldn't ignore the unsettling silence that enveloped us. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, only a suffocating quiet, as if the forest itself had been abandoned. Greg was the first to find evidence. Near a small creek, we discovered the skeletal remains of a moose. What struck us most was its condition. Perfectly clean bones, devoid of any bite marks or visible wounds. Angela, her face tense with worry, pointed to the cuts on the bones. "Look at this," she said, smooth, as if sliced with a blade or something sharp. But who would do this to wild animals, and why, out here in the middle of nowhere? Greg asked, his tone grim. None of us had answers. From there, we ventured deeper into the forest, searching for more clues. By afternoon, we had discovered 3 more skeletons, all in the same pristine state. With every find, a growing sense of dread tightened around me. It felt as though something was watching us from the shadows. At one point, I thought I saw a movement among the trees, but when I turned, there was only the swaying of branches in the wind. "We should head back," Angela said, her voice trembling. "Something's not right here." Greg shook his head. "We need to stay overnight. If someone's doing this, we have to catch them." Reluctantly, I agreed. Despite the unease gnawing at me, I couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. As night fell, we set up camp in a small clearing. The researchers installed recording equipment and cameras, hoping to capture any nocturnal activity. The fire crackled, but its light seemed feeble against the oppressive darkness around us. The sensation of being watched grew stronger. I kept staring into the shadows, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. "We need rest," one of the researchers said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." I nodded, though unease churned in my gut. Retreating to my tent, I tried to sleep, but the sound of wind rustling through the canopy and strange, faint noises in the night kept me awake. Then it happened. Around midnight, a strange sound jolted me awake. It was a soft, high-pitched screech, dragging on like metal scraping against metal. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped outside, heart pounding. Greg and Angela were already up, their faces tense. "Did you hear that?" Greg asked. I nodded, sweeping my flashlight across the darkness. Then I caught sight of something, a faint, shadowy blur moving in the air, almost transparent. It had no defined shape, just an indistinct haze darting quickly between the trees. "Did you see that?" I whispered, cold fear prickling my skin. Angela followed the beam of light, but the shadow had vanished. "What was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. Greg suggested we stay close to the fire, but when we returned, the flames had been extinguished. A chilling mist seemed to hang over the area, as if the very air had been drained of warmth. We turned on every flashlight, trying to stay calm, but the strange noises persisted. The screeching, the sound of footsteps, and even a low, labored breathing echoed from unseen sources. One of the researchers screamed, pointing ahead. We all turned and saw it, a larger, more distinct shadow moving slowly between the trees. It had no head or limbs, but something in its center swirled, absorbing the light from our flashlights. "Run!" I yelled. We bolted toward the tents, but every step felt heavier, as if the forest itself was trying to hold us back. The screeching grew louder, enveloping the entire clearing. I didn't dare look back, focused only on escaping whatever it was that defied all logic. When I woke up, it was daylight. I was lying on the ground near the extinguished fire pit, but everything around me was empty. The tents had been shredded, the equipment destroyed, and my colleagues Greg, Angela, and the research team were gone. They left no trace behind. I called out each name. "Greg! Angela! Is anyone there?" But only the echo of my own voice responded. I searched the area, desperately looking for clues about what had happened. On the ground, strange markings appeared, unlike anything I had ever seen. They resembled swirling patterns, as if some enormous tool had churned up the earth. The marks stretched far into the forest, leading deeper into the trees. I wanted to run, to leave this place immediately, but an inexplicable feeling kept me rooted. It wasn't just fear, it was an overwhelming compulsion to find out what had happened to my team. I couldn't abandon them. Gripping the flashlight, the only thing left from our camp, I followed the trail. The path took me through dense trees, their shadows stretching like claws over the forest floor. The faint morning light filtered weakly through the canopy. Along the way, I passed more animal skeletons, all stripped clean like the ones we'd found before. But this time, I noticed something even more horrifying. Some of the bones were twisted and warped, as though some immense force had brutally snapped them apart. The sensation of being watched grew stronger with every step. I turned constantly, hoping to catch sight of whatever might be stalking me. But each time I looked, all I saw were the lifeless, unmoving trees. Suddenly, a piercing screech shattered the silence, ripping through the air. The sound startled me so badly I stumbled backward, my trembling hands dropping the flashlight to the ground. When I picked it up and pointed it forward, the beam illuminated something I would never forget. A massive, shadowy figure loomed just a few meters away. It had no discernible shape, but the space around it seemed distorted, as though reality itself bent in its presence. My flashlight's beam didn't penetrate it. Instead, it reflected back a bottomless void. Despite lacking eyes or a face, the entity somehow gave the impression that it was watching me. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, as if its mere presence had frozen me in place. A low, rhythmic sound filled the air, not a voice, but a resonating hum that seemed to come from some distant, unfathomable place. Then it started to move. The shadow drifted toward me, slow and deliberate, as if testing my resolve. I staggered backward, tripping over a fallen branch and sprawling onto the ground. I tried to scream, but my throat felt constricted, like a hand was gripping it tight. In that moment, I was certain I wouldn't leave this forest alive. But then it stopped. The entity didn't attack. Instead, it turned, drawn toward something else. Following its gaze, I saw smaller shadowy forms emerging from all directions, surrounding me. These figures resembled miniature versions of the larger one, moving with unsettling speed like gusts of wind tearing across a field. I didn't wait to find out more. Taking advantage of their distraction, I scrambled to my feet and ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The screeching sounds followed me, growing louder and more chaotic with every step. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I plunged through the underbrush. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw it. Light. Sunlight streamed through an opening in the trees, a beacon of hope amid the darkness. I sprinted toward it with every ounce of strength I had left. The moment I broke free from the forest shadow, the sound stopped abruptly. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, my heart pounding like a drum. When I turned to look back at the forest, it was utterly still. No shadows, no screeches. But I knew they were still there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for their next victim. When I returned to the ranger station, Mitchell was waiting for me, his face filled with worry as he saw the state I was in. I recounted everything, the skeletons, the strange markings, and the towering shadowy figure. He listened in silence, his expression growing darker with every word. When we returned to the site with the search team, everything was gone. The skeletons, the markings, even our camp had vanished without a trace. I was the only survivor. What happened to Greg, Angela, and the research team remains a mystery. My memories of that night are fragmented, blurred images of darkness and the haunting screeches that still echo in my mind. Years later, I still wonder if I ever truly escaped that forest. It feels as though a part of me remains trapped there, among the shadows and the unanswered questions. That forest with its deathly silence and unseen horrors never really let me go. Chapter 3. The Cry. When you've been a ranger long enough, you start to recognize the unspoken rules of the deep forest. The forest has its own way of communicating. The rustling wind through the leaves, the sound of animals moving, even the silence. Everything carries meaning. But that night, the sounds I heard were unlike anything I had ever experienced. Dusk had just settled as I patrolled one of the least traveled trails in the reserve. The dim glow of the sunset was gradually replaced by darkness, and the temperature dropped quickly. It was just me, the beam of my flashlight, and the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. It was a familiar feeling, solitary but never truly alone. I knew the forest was always alive, even when you couldn't see it. Then I heard it. At first I thought I was imagining things, a faint sound almost swallowed by the wind. I stopped walking and listened, a cry. Broken, trembling, but unmistakably the cry of a woman. It came from somewhere ahead, beyond the thin veil of mist slowly enveloping the forest. My heart tightened. This area was treacherous at night, and I couldn't let anyone be in danger. I turned my flashlight toward the sound and moved forward, each step accompanied by growing apprehension. The crying didn't stop. It only became clearer, dragging on unnaturally as if it would never end. As I approached the source, my flashlight revealed a sight that made me pause. An old, dilapidated tent, covered in moss and dirt, stood in a small clearing. The scene looked frozen in time. The tent was damaged, but the items around it remained as if someone had just left. A folding chair lay toppled over, and an old oil lamp rested on the ground. The crying was coming from inside the tent. "Is anyone there?" I called out, trying to mask the unease in my voice. The crying stopped abruptly. The entire forest fell into complete silence. The sudden stillness sent a chill down my spine, as if I had just broken some unspoken rule. I took another step, feeling every nerve in my body tense like a tightly wound string. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice quieter now. There was no response, only a suffocating silence. I unzipped the tent, the flashlight beam sweeping across its interior. A woman sat huddled in a corner, her hair disheveled, her body trembling. She wore a thin, faded dress, entirely unsuitable for the chill of the forest at night. Her face was obscured by her hair, but I could see her shoulders shaking. "Are you all right? I'm a ranger here, and I'm here to help," I said, my voice as gentle as I could manage. She looked up at me, her bloodshot eyes locking onto mine. A chill ran down my spine. Those weren't the eyes of a normal person. Something was wrong. But I pushed my fear aside, trying to remain calm. "I'm lost," she rasped. "I'm looking for my son. Have you seen him?" Something in her voice kept me from walking away. It was weak yet filled with a desperate hope, as if she truly believed I had the answers. I nodded, deciding to help. "I'll help you find your son," I said. "Where did you see him last?" She pointed deeper into the forest. "I heard him calling me from there, but when I went to find him, I got lost." I hesitated. The forest at night was no place to wander, especially without proper light. But I couldn't leave a mother searching for her child. I turned up the flashlight's brightness, nodded, and looked at her. Let's go. But you need to stay close to me, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, perhaps to reassure her or maybe to calm myself. We ventured deeper into the forest, every step weighed down by an increasing sense of dread. She walked behind me, her footsteps so quiet I had to glance back frequently to ensure she was still there. The wind whistled through the trees, creating eerie sounds, almost like whispers. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. How old is your son? I asked, trying to break the oppressive silence. He's only 6, she said softly. A good boy, but he loves to wander. I told him not to go far, but he didn't listen. I nodded, though unease gnawed at me. Something didn't add up. Why would a child be here at this hour? And why was there no one else with her? I glanced back at her again. Her face seemed different now, her eyes deeper, darker, and her skin unnaturally pale under the flashlight. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the darkness and fatigue were playing tricks on me. We're close, she said suddenly, pointing ahead. I followed her gesture, but all I saw was dense, impenetrable darkness. Are you sure? I don't see anything. She nodded, her voice heavier. I can hear him. He's calling for me. Don't you hear it? I strained to listen, focusing on the sounds of the forest, but there was only silence. No, I don't hear anything, I admitted, my anxiety rising. Are you certain? She turned to me, her eyes now glowing like embers, and she smiled, a strange, unsettling smile. Don't worry, you'll hear it soon enough. Her words froze me in place. I couldn't look away from her eyes. They burned with anger, sorrow, and something deeper that I couldn't comprehend. Who are you? I asked, my voice cracking, but she didn't answer. She simply walked on, her figure fading into the mist, leaving me standing there alone in the heart of the forest. I felt an overwhelming sense that I had made a grave mistake, but I couldn't leave. The darkness around me seemed alive, closing in from all sides. In that moment, I knew this was no longer just about helping a mother find her son. I stood frozen in the forest, my flashlight trembling in my hand, its beam pointing toward where the woman had disappeared. Her figure gradually faded into the mist, each step echoing louder in my mind than in the forest itself. I can't let this go on, I muttered, then chased after her, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to stop. For the first time in my life, I felt as though I was stepping out of reality and into something that didn't belong to this world. As I ventured deeper into the forest, everything around me began to change. The trees became distorted, as though stretched by some invisible force. The light from my flashlight struggled to pierce through the dense fog, creating only faint, flickering halos in the darkness. The sound of her footsteps echoed ahead of me, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't catch up to her. Each time I thought I was close, she would vanish behind a tree or into the shadows. The mist seemed to swallow her whole, leaving me alone with a growing sense of dread. Then I heard the laughter. It was no longer the crying I had heard earlier, but a low, distorted chuckle, as if someone was laughing from a great distance, yet somehow directly into my ear. The sound chilled me to the bone, each note scraping against my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. I stopped, my eyes scanning the forest, but there was nothing but darkness and fog. "Where are you?" I shouted, my voice echoing through the trees. The laughter stopped. A deathly silence engulfed the forest, pressing down on me like a weight. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, her voice spoke again, but it was no longer soft or gentle. It was hoarse, guttural, filled with malice. "Do you want to meet my son?" I didn't answer. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. I could only stand there, gripping the flashlight tightly, its unsteady beam sweeping through the mist. Her silhouette emerged again, this time much closer, only a few meters away. Her face was no longer that of a lost woman. Her eyes glowed a fiery red, her pallid skin stretched taut over her bones, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque, unnatural grin. "Why won't you answer me?" she asked, her voice echoing like a distorted whisper from a deep cave. "Don't you want to help me?" I took a step back, my hands gripping the flashlight as if it were my lifeline. "Who are you? What do you really want?" She didn't respond. Instead, she stepped closer, and with each step, the mist around her seemed to burn away like smoke. I aimed the flashlight directly at her face, hoping the light would stop her, but it only made her glowing eyes blaze more fiercely. "Do you know what it's like to lose a child?" she asked, her voice trembling with anger and anguish. "Do you know what it's like to search desperately, only to find nothing but emptiness?" I had no answer. Everything about her, her voice, her movements, her eyes, filled me with the urge to flee, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. She came closer, and I noticed something in her hand, a battered, tattered doll, its dress stained with dark red marks. What, what do you want from me?" I stammered. She stopped, staring straight at me with those burning eyes. "I want you to feel it. Feel my pain." Before I could react, she lunged at me. I fell backward, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and rolling away. She leaned over me, her face mere inches from mine. The stench of decay filled my nostrils, and I could see every crack in her pale, lifeless skin. "Look into my eyes," she commanded, her voice no longer human. I couldn't resist. Her fiery eyes locked onto mine, pulling me in like a vortex, burning into my mind. In that moment, I was no longer in the forest. I saw images flash before me. A boy running through the woods, his faint voice calling for his mother, a knife glinting in the dim light, a scream and blood splattering across the forest floor. The truth hit me like a blow. This woman wasn't searching for her son. She had killed him. I screamed, trying to break free from her gaze. My hand flailed and found the flashlight, and with the last ounce of strength I had, I switched it on. The beam struck her face, and she recoiled, screaming in agony. I seized the opportunity to scramble to my feet, grab the flashlight, and run as fast as I could through the forest. Her screams echoed behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran, desperate to escape her, to escape the forest. Eventually, I saw the faint glow of the ranger station in the distance. I sprinted toward it, my chest heaving with terror. The next morning, when I recounted the events to Mitchell, he gave me a skeptical look. Then he pulled out an old file and placed it on the table in front of me. It was a report from 20 years ago. A woman had killed her son in the forest before taking her own life. The police never uncovered a motive. "You mean it was her?" I stammered. Mitchell nodded. "You're not the first to see her, but you're lucky to be alive to tell the story." I looked out the station window at the forest bathed in morning light, but even in daylight I couldn't shake the feeling that her burning red eyes were still watching me from the shadows. The Strange Hunter. It was a cold winter day about 25 years ago. Snow blanketed the northern forest of Arizona, and everything was immersed in nature's silence. I had just finished a week of duty and was patrolling to inspect the legal hunting areas near the edge of the preserve. This job often brought a sense of peace, but that day, a strange feeling lingered in my mind, as though I was stepping into a territory that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The first sound of footsteps I heard was faint, like a branch snapping under someone's weight. When I stopped and turned to look around, there was nothing but towering pine trees and a misty veil covering the ground. But I knew someone was nearby. Fresh footprints in the snow, large and deep, were only a few meters away. They were not from an animal. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice calm as it echoed in the silence. Seconds later, from the distance within the mist, a man appeared. He was tall, wearing a worn leather coat, a knit cap that covered half his head, and carrying a large hunting rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't resemble the usual hunters I encountered. There was something about his piercing gaze that I couldn't look away from. "Hello," he replied, his voice hoarse and low. "I didn't know there were rangers in this area. What are you doing here?" I squinted, trying to appear relaxed. "Just inspecting the area. This is a licensed hunting zone, but I need to make sure no one crosses the preserve boundary. And you? What are you hunting?" The man smiled, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, just hunting rare things. Exotic animals, you know. I've been doing this all my life." "Really?" I said, trying to read more from his expression. "Do you have a license?" He let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Of course, Ranger. I'm no amateur." But when I asked to see his license, he quickly changed the subject, spinning bizarre stories about predators he had encountered. He spoke of wolves larger than normal, deer with unsettling eyes, but what unnerved me most was the way he described, in disturbing detail, the thrill of chasing prey. After parting ways with the man, I continued my patrol, but I couldn't shake his image from my mind. His footprints led me to another area where I found strange signs. broken branches pointing in a specific direction, stones arranged in triangles, and knife marks carved into tree trunks, almost like a system of coded markers. I followed the trail, my curiosity mixed with suspicion. It led me deeper into the forest, to a small clearing blanketed in thick snow. At the center of the clearing, I found a bear trap carelessly set, with something strange hanging above it, a small, old child's sweater caked in dirt and mud. Immediately, a chill ran down my spine. Someone had deliberately set this trap, not for animals, but for something far more sinister. I didn't return to the ranger station immediately. Instead, I continued to follow the trail I had found. The snow fell heavier, and the fog grew thicker until I could see only a few meters ahead. But then I realized the tracks I was following weren't just one set. Beside the large footprints of the man I had met, there were smaller ones, like those of a child. A wave of fear surged through me. I quickened my pace, sweeping my flashlight through the mist. My heavy breathing mingled with the sound of the wind howling through the trees. Suddenly, I stopped. Ahead, through the fog, was the man. He stood still, his back to me, seemingly doing something on the ground. "What are you doing here?" I called out loudly, my hand instinctively moving to the knife on my belt. He didn't respond immediately, but when he finally turned to face me, his gaze was cold and full of challenge. "Just setting traps, Ranger," he said, his tone calm yet laced with hidden meaning. "We all have our games to play, don't we?" I knew I couldn't let this continue. "This area is restricted. You need to leave immediately." The man chuckled, then said something I will never forget. "You don't understand, Ranger. This forest belongs to me. I don't hunt animals. I hunt what's worthy." Before I could react, he stepped backward into the thick fog and disappeared like a ghost. I tried to follow, but his footprints were quickly buried by the falling snow, as though they had never existed. After several minutes of futile searching, I stumbled upon a small, decrepit tent hidden beneath a large tree. As I stepped inside, an unnatural chill filled the air, as if all life had been drained from the space. Inside, I was met with a chilling sight. Wooden boxes were neatly stacked, filled with mementos, clothes, shoes, children's toys, and even journals. On one wall of the tent hung old photographs of various people, likely victims who had disappeared in this forest. I returned to the ranger station in a panic. When I brought Mitchell and the police back to the area, the tent was gone, as though it had never been there. Only the heavy snow and the silent mist remained. That night, I lay awake, haunted by countless questions. Who was that man? What had he done to the missing people? And was I meant to be his next target in this twisted game? The answers, I fear, still linger somewhere within the dense trees and heavy fog of that forest. Chapter 5. Into the Cursed Territory. The forest this morning carried an unusual, tranquil beauty. Sunlight pierced through the dense canopy, creating sparkling patterns on the damp ground. However, as a seasoned ranger, I knew this silence often masked something unsettling. Over the years working in this reserve, I had witnessed it all: sudden storms, aggressive wildlife, and eerie signs of illegal activity. Today's patrol began like any other. I checked trails, noted ecosystem changes, and ensured no signs of prohibited activities. But as I ventured deeper into a remote part of the forest, I stumbled upon something that made my stomach drop. Traps. The traps were expertly placed, most hidden beneath leaves and branches. Some were sharp metal clamps, their teeth glinting in the faint light, ready to snap shut on any unfortunate creature. Others were snare traps tied to young trees, designed to tighten around anything that stepped into them. They were the work of poachers, ruthless individuals who exploited wildlife for profit, ignoring the law and the suffering they caused. I inspected each trap, disabling them with my tools. Each cut wire or dismantled spring reminded me of the animals that had likely suffered here. A fawn with a mangled leg, a squirrel strangled to death. These images lingered in my mind. As I dismantled the fifth trap, a chill ran down my spine. I froze, listening intently. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no rustling leaves. A deathly stillness enveloped the area. Standing up, I gripped the handle of the knife at my side. "Is someone there?" I called, my voice echoing through the dense woods. No answer came, but I knew I wasn't alone. When I turned, everything happened in an instant. A powerful force knocked me to the ground. Before I could react, 3 figures emerged from the bushes around me. They wore hoods, their faces concealed by scarves, leaving only their eyes visible, eyes brimming with hostility. One held me down, while another pressed the muzzle of a hunting rifle to my face. "A ranger, huh?" The man with the gun sneered, his deep voice dripping with mockery. "What do you think you're doing out here?" I struggled to remain calm, though my heart was pounding. "You're breaking the law. This is a protected area. Leave now." My words elicited laughter from the group. Their laughter was cold and lifeless. "The law," one of them said. "The law means nothing here, friend. This forest belongs to us." They tied me up, binding my wrists tightly with rope, and dragged me to my feet. I was forced to lead them through trails in the forest where I suspected more traps might be set. I tried to memorize every detail about them, their voices, their movements, the way they handled their weapons, hoping that information would help later. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. "We want to know what you know," the man with the rifle said. "How many traps have you seen? Have you reported this to anyone?" I shook my head, trying to conceal my fear. "No, I haven't reported it yet. I was just on patrol." They exchanged cold, silent glances. I knew they didn't trust me, and that realization tightened the knot of dread in my chest. They led me deeper into the forest, to an area I had never explored. There, I found undeniable evidence of their poaching operation. Discarded animal bones, piles of animal skins stacked haphazardly, and even a small truck camouflaged with branches and leaves. These weren't just amateur hunters, they were an organized group. "Do you like our little operation?" one of them asked, his cold eyes fixed on me. "We've been here for a long time. No one can stop us." I didn't reply. My mind was racing, searching desperately for a way out. As night fell, they stopped at a small clearing in the woods. They set up a makeshift camp, lit a fire, and took turns keeping an eye on me. Bound to a tree, my hands and arms had gone numb from the tight ropes. My thoughts raced, trying to find any weakness in their plan. I noticed that one of them frequently left to check the traps, leaving the other two by the fire. They seemed less vigilant as the night wore on, engrossed in their conversation. I watched, waited, and observed every move they made. Finally, my chance came. When the man who had been checking the traps left again, I spotted a sharp rock near where I was tied. Slowly, carefully, I inched toward it, trying not to make a sound. The rope around my wrists began to fray as I ground it against the rock, strand by strand. It took nearly an hour, but eventually I was free. I waited for the man with the rifle to step away from the fire to check his surroundings. The moment he turned his back, I bolted into the shadows, running as fast as I could through the dense forest. Shouts erupted behind me as they realized I had escaped. I heard footsteps crashing through the underbrush and the deafening sound of a gunshot echoing through the trees. But I didn't stop. I sprinted over fallen logs, through thorny bushes, my breath ragged and my body screaming in pain. I knew that stopping meant death. Finally, I saw the faint glow of the ranger station lights in the distance. I dashed toward it, collapsing through the door and locking it behind me. My body trembled, sweat pouring down my face as I called Mitchell and the authorities, recounting everything in a breathless rush. When the police arrived, the poachers were gone. There were no traps, no animal remains, no sign of their operation. The forest had returned to its eerie calm, as though nothing had happened. I knew those men wouldn't stop. They had disappeared into the shadows, but their presence lingered like a scar on the forest. I couldn't forget their faces, hidden behind scarves, eyes devoid of mercy. The forest, from that day forward, was never the same. Chapter 6. The Hidden Room. The forest was quieter than usual that day. I was patrolling a rarely visited area where the trees grew so densely that sunlight could only trickle through the thick canopy. The rustling of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirping of forest birds were the only sounds I could hear. Yet deep within me, there was an odd sensation I couldn't explain. I don't clearly remember how I stumbled upon the house. Perhaps it was the natural curiosity of a ranger, or maybe something else guided me. The house appeared suddenly, nestled in a small clearing amidst the dense woods. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The house looked like it had been abandoned for ages. The roof had partially caved in, the wooden walls were rotting, and the shattered windows exposed a dusty interior. But what caught my attention the most wasn't its dilapidated state. It was the chilling atmosphere surrounding it, despite it being the height of summer. I stepped onto the wooden porch, careful not to let my weight splinter the fragile boards. The front door was ajar, creaking eerily as I pushed it open. Inside was a familiar scene for abandoned places: broken furniture, scattered papers on the floor, and a thick, musty smell that hit my nose immediately. I swept my flashlight across the room, searching for any sign that someone had been here recently. But everything was old and silent, as if time had stopped. Just as I was about to leave, my beam froze on a corner of the room, where a tattered rug had been pushed aside, revealing a wooden trapdoor in the floor. The trapdoor didn't match the rest of the house. It was made of thick, sturdy wood, with heavy metal hinges that looked surprisingly new. Kneeling down, I felt a cold draft seeping through the crack. My heartbeat quickened as I realized something was very wrong here. Gripping the handle of the knife at my side, I used my other hand to lift the trapdoor. It was heavy, groaning loudly as its hinges strained. Beneath it was a staircase leading into darkness. "What kind of basement is this?" I muttered, shining my flashlight down the steps. The wooden stairs looked oddly solid compared to the ruined state of the house. Once again, I felt like I shouldn't go down, but curiosity and duty compelled me. The room below wasn't very large, but it was big enough to make me feel like I had stepped into another world. My flashlight illuminated cold cement walls, covered with pinned-up documents, photographs, and maps. A large table sat in the center, cluttered with a tape recorder, old newspapers, and thick folders. I picked up one of the files, and a shiver immediately ran down my spine. It was a dossier on missing persons, children, adults, even families who had vanished without a trace over the past several decades. All the cases occurred in areas near this forest. I recognized a few names from reports I had read in past investigations, but no one had ever found a single clue. I flipped through more papers, feeling a growing sense of dread. A photograph of a smiling family was marked with a large red X. A list of locations in the forest had many of its entries crossed out. Worst of all were crude sketches depicting traps, tools, and what looked like a small room with chains hanging from the walls. I couldn't stay there any longer. This room wasn't just a storage space for information. It was evidence of something larger and far darker. I quickly gathered a few files and a notebook, stuffing them into my backpack. But as I prepared to climb back up the stairs and leave, a sound stopped me cold. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoed from the wooden floor above. My heart stopped as I realized someone had entered the house. I switched off my flashlight, holding my breath to avoid making any noise. The footsteps grew closer, stopping directly above the trapdoor. Then I heard the sound of it being pulled open, and light from above spilled into the basement. A shadowy figure appeared, holding a gun pointed straight at me. "You shouldn't be here, my friend," the man said, his voice low and icy. I froze, my mind racing for a way out. The man descended the stairs, his gun never wavering. In the dim light, I could see his face clearly. Cold, piercing eyes, a face lined with scars, and a twisted smile that made my skin crawl. He stopped a few steps away from me, the barrel of his gun aimed squarely at my chest. "You've seen too much," he said, his expression unchanging. "And now you have to stay." Desperation surged through me, but I knew I couldn't let him maintain control of the situation. The room was cramped, but I realized there was only one way out. I had to act first. My breathing was heavy, my heart pounding as though it might explode. The man standing before me didn't even waver with the gun in his hand. In the cramped space of the room, the air seemed to have been sucked out. With each passing second, I felt as if the concrete walls were closing in, pushing me into a corner with no way out. "You've seen too much," he repeated, his low voice rasping like rusted metal. "And I can't let you leave." I knew I had to do something, and there wasn't much time. "Listen," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I don't know what this is all about, and I don't want to know. I'm just a ranger out on patrol. Let me go, and I won't tell anyone anything." He laughed, a twisted grin that sent a chill down my spine. "You think I'd believe you? Everything you've seen here, it's all I've worked so hard to keep hidden for years." I realized there was no convincing him. He had no intention of letting me go. My mind raced, searching for a way out. I scanned the room for anything I could use. On the table, not far from me, lay a metal flashlight, heavy enough to serve as a weapon if I could reach it. He kept talking, his tone cold as if delivering a lecture. This forest belongs to me. Those who stray, those foolish families, they all met their end by their own doing. You think you'll be any different? I kept my eyes from flicking toward the flashlight, not wanting him to notice I was planning something. Instead, I tried to stall. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice thick with doubt. What did they ever do to deserve this? My question seemed to give him pause. He stared at me, his eyes burning with unchecked rage. "They stepped into my territory. This is where I'm in control. No one has the right to trespass." Seizing the moment he was distracted, I lunged for the table, my hand reaching for the flashlight. He reacted faster than I'd expected, slamming the butt of his gun into my shoulder and knocking me to the floor. Pain flared, but I didn't stop. I twisted around, using all my strength to swing the flashlight into his arm. The gun fell to the ground with a harsh clang. I didn't give him a chance to grab it. I jumped up, kicked the gun away, and sent it skidding into the corner of the room. He roared and rushed at me, but in the cramped space, I had the advantage. I pivoted, striking him on the head with the flashlight. He stumbled, blood trickling down his forehead. I didn't let up, shoving him to the floor before darting up the stairs. As I reached the top of the basement steps, I heard him bellow from behind me, "You won't escape. We'll find you." His words only spurred me on. I burst out of the house without looking back. The sun had set, and the forest was draped in darkness. I ran as fast as I could, my legs numb with terror. Branches and brambles tore at my skin, but I refused to stop. I had no idea how long I'd been running, but at last the lights of the ranger station came into view. I'd never felt such relief. At the station, I called the police immediately, recounting everything I had seen and experienced. They listened with serious expressions, but I could sense their skepticism in the way they responded. When they arrived and followed me back into the woods to investigate, I led them to the house, but by the time we reached it, the place looked different. The traces I'd seen before, from the trapdoor to the underground room, were gone. The house stood as it had, but there was no sign of any basement, nor any evidence of what I had discovered inside. "Maybe you were mistaken," one officer offered sympathetically. "You might have been too exhausted." I didn't argue. How could I convince them when all proof had been erased? But I knew what I'd seen and what I'd lived through. The man wasn't just unhinged, he was dangerous, and he wasn't working alone. Over the following days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. Whenever I ventured into the forest, I felt a pair of eyes tracking me from the shadows. Sometimes at night, I'd hear footsteps outside my house, but whenever I checked, there was no one. That house in the woods, the underground room, and that man, all of it haunted my nightmares. But what frightened me most wasn't what I'd endured, but what I'd failed to stop. What I'd found was just the tip of the iceberg, and deeper in the forest's darkness lay even more sinister secrets. Chapter 7. The Prison. The dense forest on the southern edge was a place I often patrolled, but today something felt off. There was a heavy foreboding in the air, as though the forest itself was trying to warn me. The deeper I ventured, the more strange traces I found. A seldom-used path looked like it had been trampled by heavy footsteps, and I came across a line of boot prints leading to an old building I had never seen before. The building lay hidden behind a thick clump of trees. Despite being worn down by time, it stood tall with its dark, blackened brick walls and windows sealed by metal bars. The air around it felt colder, and as I drew closer, I realized this was no mere abandoned structure. It had once been a prison. I approached the rusted iron gate, gripping my flashlight. Before I could go inside, a voice called out from within, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" I turned and saw a tall man behind me. He wore old, tattered clothes, his gaze sharp but not overtly hostile. "I'm a ranger," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I noticed something unusual and came to check the area." He narrowed his eyes at me for a long moment, then suddenly broke into a smile. "That's good. We're protecting this place too. Come in, and we'll explain." Although my instincts told me something was amiss, I couldn't refuse his invitation. If they truly were just a harmless group, declining might raise suspicion. But if it was otherwise, I needed to find out what they were doing here. Inside the prison, the atmosphere was heavier than I had expected. The thick walls still stood solid, and the dim light filtering through narrow openings wasn't enough to dispel the gloom. The men and women who lived there looked at me with strange expressions. Their clothes were old and worn, but what unsettled me most was their silence. None of them spoke. They just watched me, as though judging my every move. The man led me down a long corridor. Our footsteps echoed, and I noticed the place had been refurbished for use. The iron doors lining the hallway appeared recently reinforced, and some of the cells were still intact. I tried to keep my composure, though my heart pounded at the realization of what those doors were meant for. "How long have you been here?" I asked, hoping to stall and gather more information. "Long enough to know how to keep everything secure," he replied, his tone tinged with menace. "This forest isn't somewhere you can just wander freely." I felt the unspoken threat in his words. At the end of the corridor, he stopped at a large door. "This is what we're protecting," he said, then opened it. Behind the door was a large room, dimly lit by a few hanging bulbs, but what grabbed my attention immediately were the captives. They were locked in cells, their hands and feet bound with coarse rope. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes filled with despair. A few of them rushed to the bars upon seeing me, crying out for help, but the man's cold laughter soon drowned out their pleas. "What are you doing?" I asked, striving to keep my voice steady but unable to hide my suspicion. "These people aren't good," he said in a flat tone. "They came here with bad intentions. We're merely protecting this area from trespassers." I knew that wasn't true. The imprisoned souls didn't look threatening at all. They were victims, and I now found myself in the midst of an organization more dangerous than anything I had faced before. I realized I needed to get out. But before I could think of a plan, a firm hand clamped onto my shoulder. I spun around to see another man with a cold look in his eyes and a gun in his hand. "We think you should stay," he sneered, a crooked grin spreading across his face. They intended to make me their next prisoner. I was forced into an empty cell, hands and feet tied. As the iron door slammed shut, the first man let out a booming laugh. "You really think you can interfere here? This is our territory. No one escapes." Sitting inside the cell, I tried to stay calm. I knew rescue wouldn't just come on its own. Glancing around, I noticed a small piece of metal on the floor. Stretching out, I grabbed it and began sawing away at the rope. Each second felt like an eternity, but at last the rope snapped. I waited until the hallway was quiet, then carefully opened the cell door. The faint light from the bulbs allowed me to move without being seen. I knew they were armed, and any slip could spell the end for me. As I approached the exit, I heard footsteps coming closer. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding. One of the men walked past without noticing me. Seizing the moment, I dashed toward the main entrance, flung it open, and ran into the forest. Shouts erupted behind me as they discovered I'd escaped. Gunfire rang out, bullets whistling past my ears, but I kept running. The forest was like a maze, but I forced myself to stay focused. At last, I saw the lights of the main road ahead and stumbled onto it, collapsing in exhaustion. I called the police as soon as I could, then led them back to the prison. But by the time we arrived, everything had been cleared out. There was no sign of the prisoners, their captors, or any evidence whatsoever. The building was empty, silent, as though nothing had happened there at all. I couldn't forget the desperate eyes of the captives or the chilling laughter of the ones who held them. Though I escaped, I knew the dark shadow of that forest prison still loomed. And perhaps those people were still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for their next prey.